Well, hey, welcome back to Core 52. I'm Jason. I'm the creative director and worship pastor here at Aldersgate Church. With me today is my friend Seth Timmons. I've met Seth years ago doing worship things himself. He has been a worship pastor. He has led worship in many places, so we thought we'd call him in to talk about worship today. This is week 34. We're going to talk about worship and what does it really look like to worship God. So Seth, can you kind of break that down for us from your perspective of what that really looks like to worship God?
Absolutely. I think number one, you need a really good worship song. Maybe Chris Tomlin, How Great Is Our God? You need a strong, this is where we were, okay, yeah, this is awkward. No, I honestly, for worship, I think for me, it's such a complex issue in the church right now. Because in my experiences, I've seen worship divide churches. I've seen worship turn into something that it's not. And I love what Mark Moore really talked about in the chapter on worship, in John chapter 4, with the woman at the well. And to me, that's worship. And I think it's okay for us to kind of stop and put ourselves in that story if we're the woman at the well. Jesus, we can talk about the cultural things, we can talk about how crazy and awkward that situation must have been for her, not really for Jesus. But he steps into her situation and he crosses so many lines in that moment, and probably us spiritual people, us religious people would go, Jesus, what are you doing? To understand that context at the time. But for me, it's so profound how Jesus steps into her life. He steps into her life and he simply, and we're talking about water. Like we're talking about a simple, I'm thirsty. Like you see Jesus in his humanity, I'm thirsty, will you give me a drink? And the woman is just like, this is weird, this is crazy. And
this Jew is talking to a Samaritan,
exactly,
number one, yeah.
Exactly. And for us, like when we think about worship, like we're not, like this story has nothing to do with music. Which is you and I's experience of leading worship is we're singing songs and we're trying to get people engaged in song. But Jesus is trying to get this woman engaged in what his mission is. And it's such a profound moment. And so, we fast forward into this moment where he says, the Father is seeking these kind of worshipers that worship in spirit and in truth. And I love what Bob Coughlin talks about in his book, Worship Matters. He talks about how, and I'll just put this in my context, if I were to go home and I were to tell Chelsea, my wife, hey, I love your beautiful blonde hair and blue eyes, she would punch me in the face because she doesn't have blonde hair, blue eyes, right? And she hits hard. I'm telling you, she hits hard. But no, I'm kidding. Again, we're awkward, but that's great. But that's kind of this moment where Jesus wants to push past our preconceived notions of what worship is. And really, the spirit and truth, like we get the spirit part on some levels. We want to engage, in song, or we want to engage in reading the Word, and we want to hear the Word, we want to teach the Word. But the truth part, man, that's really where I think we get tripped up sometimes. Is that I've got to approach worship with a certain religiosity, if that's even a word, a certain set of standards, right? And that woman, like she was caught in the middle of her mess, man. Like Jesus met her in her mess. And people were saved because of her testimony. They were saved because of her experience with Jesus. And so I think about that, just like worship is so much more than just us trying to clean ourselves up, but really it's saying, God, you know what? I don't want to worship today. I don't feel like worshiping. I don't know where you are. I don't feel you. I don't feel your presence. And we kind of get into that, like we're afraid to confess that to the Lord. Does that make sense?
Yeah. You mentioned a minute ago, like our preconceived notions of worship. So can you describe for us, like what your, I guess, perceptions of worship were as a kid, like growing up?
Yeah. So I grew up in the early part of my life in a Methodist church. And my dad was a baritone in the choir. And my mom was adamant about sitting front row and center. So if you're familiar with First United Methodist Church Canyon, it's a center aisle and outside. So there's two sections of the church, and we were front and center. And so my dad always had eyes on me. And I was that kid, front row that's like shoving pencils in my ears and nose and directing the choir whenever he's singing. And so I had obviously a disgruntled father all the time. Yeah, it was always
pointed at you.
Actually, no, he did. He was really proud, and he would always, elbow the guy next to him and be like, "Yeah, that's my son. I'm proud of him." You just gotta own it, right? You just gotta own it, right? But my mom was super embarrassed. But so really, my experience growing up was real stiff. Like worship was kind of like something the choir did, and then you had this beautiful choir director voice that was coming from the pulpit that was leading us. And I think for me, like there was never really an understanding of what I'm singing, B, why I'm singing. And it was a real kind of weird thing. And it wasn't until I really got to high school and got around my friends who were serious about their faith that I started to learn really what worship was. And I'll tell you, just from a personal experience, I was 21 when I lost my dad. And he just died suddenly of a heart attack, and that's when worship really became real. And I know that sounds morbid, but really that was, and it kind of goes along with it, a Spurgeon quote when he says, "When grief pushes your face to the dirt, worship there." And so for me, my life really kind of, for several years from losing my dad, and then several years later losing my mom, like it was marked by grief. And so worship became this real authentic, man, where are you at? Like what you're coming to the well, what are you what well are you drawing from? And I think for me, it was drawing from that security, drawing from, all these things that weren't satisfying. And so that was a pivotal moment for me, worship wise.
And he talks about that in the essay about how a lot of the words for worship, he talks about getting low, laying yourself before his feet, having that fear, that reverence, that awe of who he is, and being driven down more than raising our hands or shouting or things like that.
Exactly. And even just as a worship leader, and man, just to let you in this world, like there's so many worship leaders out there that wrap their identity in how many hands are raised, how many eyes are closed. I can't tell you how many times I would look out and I would see this, or I would see hand in pockets, and that might be you. And I'm just being honest with you. There were times that I was judgmental towards that, because when you think about like many of us that like we're Tar Heel fans, right? Mm-hmm. Like I went and watched Duke UNC, like I was there, and there wasn't a butt in the chair. Like you're up and you're excited and you're moving, and in the same way, it's not to Jesus juke, but it's like really what Christ has done for us should evoke that kind of response in us. But again, we're drawing from a well that's got us to this, and I just commend you, church, for pursuing biblical literacy. I commend you for diving into what Mark Moore is kind of pushing you towards, because this right now, especially right now, I mean, we could take 2020 and just kick it to the curb. I mean, really, honestly. But what just a profound thing when you look at the chaos all around. What a great way for us to engage in authentic, real worship, to say, Lord, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't even know what's going to happen this afternoon, but we trust you, and we want to be obedient to that.
Yeah. If you can, in as much of a nutshell as we can put that in, how do you describe to somebody what Mark talks about in that essay about worshiping from the inside out? He's talking about worshiping from your spirit first, then to your mind, will, and emotions, your soul, and then through your body.
Yeah, I mean, that was preaching to me, and I've been a worship leader for years. And I love what he said, and I'll say this. The nature of Christian worship honors the Father as experienced through Jesus by the indwelling of the Spirit. Later on, he says, the Spirit leads us to the truth embodied in Jesus, who escorts us directly to the Father. And it just goes back to an honest heart. I think it goes back to, Lord, this is where I'm at, and I've got to draw from your well. I've got to draw from, man, I just watched my child be born, and it's the most amazing thing, and I want to thank you for that. I just want to get before you and say, I can't even keep up with my car keys, and you're giving me this child. Thank you for that. I just watched my mom take her last breath, and the first thought in my head is, he is not here. He is risen, and she is not here. She is with the King, and it evokes that worship, and just being honest there, just being honest with the Father, and He will. And you go back to John 1, and John constantly says, "I am not the source. I am not the light. I'm only a witness to the light. I'm only a testimony to the light." That to me is inside out worship.
Yeah. I think for us, as individuals and as a body, the key thing is what you're saying. We want to worship through music. We use music as a tool, as a vessel, but it's about the lyrics that speak to our heart, move our spirit, which in turn activates our soul, which in turn activates those physical demonstrative movements that we talk about in worship. But it's not about the music. It's not about being demonstrative or not being demonstrative. It's not about any of those things. More than anything, it's about spirit and truth, and watching those two things kind of come together. So we're glad you joined us today. We hope you're still enjoying Core 52. I agree with Seth. I love that we're diving into the Word, that we're kind of tackling biblical illiteracy on a certain level. So if you have any questions about worship, if you have anything to comment, please put it down below. Send us a DM, hit us up on Facebook, or send us an email. We'd love to engage with you. Otherwise, we'll see you next week. Y'all have a good one.
See you guys.